The Phantom of Blackthorn Manor. A Miss Marple mystery. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm, golden light across the sprawling lawns of Blackthorn Manor. The air was filled with the fragrance of blooming roses and freshly cut grass, the occasional hum of bees flitting from flower to flower, adding to the peaceful hum of the afternoon. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the English countryside, had never known a more tranquil day. It was the sort of day that made the heart swell with simple contentment, a moment when time itself seemed to stretch, giving the impression that there was nothing in the world that could disturb the idyllic harmony of the present. Miss Marple sat by the window of the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking in time with the conversation around her. The guests, an assortment of local gentry and townsfolk, had gathered for the garden party at Blackthorn Manor, and the manor's large windows offered a sweeping view of the festivities. The chatter and laughter floated in from the garden, where long tables were adorned with delicate porcelain cups and plates of finely cut sandwiches. Sir Randolph Hastings, the host of the gathering, stood near the center of it all, greeting his guests with his characteristic charm and wide smile. His tall, commanding frame cast a shadow on the lawn, yet there was something about him that seemed perpetually uneasy, as if the weight of the manor, its history, its secrets, pressed on his shoulders in ways he never fully acknowledged. Miss Marple, ever the observer, took in the scene with the quiet expertise she had honed over a lifetime of village gossip, petty squabbles, and hidden resentments. She had seen the way the villagers interacted with each other, how Lady Emily Hawthorne, so young and wide-eyed, looked at Sir Randolph with a gaze that lingered just a bit too long, or how Major Everard Blackwell, the retired army officer, seemed to find every conversation an opportunity to boast about his days of glory. Even the scholarly Dr. Horace Minton, who preferred his books to human company, was somehow always a little too eager to engage in intellectual sparring with anyone who would listen. And then there was Sylvia Bradford, the enigmatic newcomer, who had arrived in Blackthorn Manor only a few months ago. There was something about her that set Miss Marple's finely tuned instincts on edge. She was a woman of mystery, or at least that was how she seemed to the others. Sylvia's smile was always too quick, her laugh just a little too practiced, and though her eyes sparkled with wit, Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that there were more layers to her than anyone cared to uncover. "Miss Marple, you're awfully quiet today," Lady Emily remarked as she passed by with a glass of champagne in hand, her voice lilting with that youthful enthusiasm that always seemed just a little too eager. "You must join us out in the garden soon. It's a splendid day for it." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with a gentle smile, her hands stilling in their work. "Indeed, Lady Emily. But sometimes, my dear, the best part of a gathering is watching from the sidelines. I find that one learns more that way." Lady Emily chuckled softly, and Miss Marple returned her attention to the party, watching as the guests mingled beneath the shade of the ancient oak trees. Sir Randolph was speaking with Major Blackwell, his voice steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his posture, a tension that no one else seemed to see. There were whispers, too, that swirled about Sylvia Bradford. Some said she was in need of a fresh start after a broken engagement. Others claimed she had been widowed under mysterious circumstances. None of these rumors were confirmed, of course, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that where there were whispers, there were truths waiting to be discovered. The afternoon passed slowly, each moment rich with the sounds of clinking teacups, laughter, and the soft rustling of skirts on the well-tended grass. The manor grounds, with their neatly arranged flower beds and meticulously trimmed hedges, were a fitting backdrop for such a gathering. And yet, beneath the picturesque surface, there was something amiss, something Miss Marple could not quite put her finger on. Perhaps it was the stillness in the air, or the way the conversations seemed a little too rehearsed. It was a gathering of people, each putting on their best faces, pretending that everything in their lives was in perfect order. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the garden, Miss Marple found herself standing by the window again, her gaze lingering on the figures below. It was then that she heard it, a faint sound, the unmistakable slam of a door opening in the distance. At first, no one seemed to notice. It was a garden party after all, and such noises were hardly cause for alarm. But then came the scream. It was shrill, piercing, and entirely out of place in the peaceful surroundings of Blackthorn Manor. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though she remained perfectly composed. She stood up from her chair, her knitting abandoned in an instant, and made her way toward the hall. The others had already gathered, and a wave of unease rippled through the group. Sylvia Bradford was at the center, her face pale and her hands shaking as she clutched a letter to her chest. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice carrying just above the murmurs of the others. "It's Mr. Fenwick," Sylvia said, her voice trembling. "He's gone, vanished. I went to check on him, but his room is locked, and there's no sign of him anywhere." The guests exchanged glances, their faces momentarily frozen in disbelief. Mr. Fenwick, the butler, was a fixture of the manor, a man whose presence had been as reliable as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. For him to disappear, especially so, abruptly, was utterly unthinkable. "We must find him," Sir Randolph said, his voice tight. His calm demeanor had been shaken, and his hands, normally so steady, now fidgeted at his sides. He could have simply gone for a walk or fallen ill. But Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, saw the subtle shift in the air, the tightening of nerves, the way the guests began to exchange glances, each of them attempting to make sense of what was happening. Something was wrong. She could feel it, and she knew, as she always did, that the answers were hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered by those who knew how to listen. "I'll go check the grounds," Major Blackwell said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "There's no need to panic just yet." But Miss Marple remained still, her keen eyes taking in every detail, every movement, every subtle glance. She had seen enough to know that this was no ordinary disappearance. The game, it seemed, had already begun. The manor was in a flurry of disarray as the search for Mr. Fenwick continued. Sir Randolph had gone to check the servants' quarters himself, while Major Blackwell, with his military precision, had started combing the grounds with an efficiency that made Miss Marple feel, for a brief moment, that the mystery would be resolved quickly. But something about the entire situation nagged at her. The guests, who moments ago had been wrapped in light conversation, now wore expressions of confusion and anxiety, the unsettling nature of the disappearance weaving a tight web of tension between them. Sylvia Bradford, still clutching the letter to her chest, stood by the doorway, her gaze fixed on the floor as though afraid to meet anyone's eyes. Miss Marple's attention lingered on her for a moment longer than was customary, a quiet suspicion blooming at the back of her mind. She had seen that expression before, someone who was either hiding something or too afraid to speak of it. The letter, clutched so tightly, seemed to be at the heart of it all. The others had moved off to their tasks, the chatter growing fainter as people scattered to check the gardens and outbuildings. Miss Marple remained still, her keen eyes studying the room with the precision of a hawk. She had no intention of rushing into action, not yet. Some things required patience, observation, quiet understanding. And she had learned, long ago, that the truth was often the last thing anyone noticed until it was too late. Sylvia's hands trembled as she finally allowed the letter to fall from her grip. Miss Marple noticed it immediately. Small but telling. Sylvia's lips parted as if to say something, but then snapped shut, as if she were weighing her words carefully. She raised her eyes briefly, meeting Miss Marple's gaze with a flicker of apprehension. There was a moment's pause, heavy with unspoken tension, before Sylvia spoke, her voice low and shaky. "Do you think he's gone for good?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately, her gaze soft but steady. There was more in Sylvia's voice than simple concern. It was a question laden with an underlying fear, an unspoken worry. Miss Marple took a step closer, her soft footsteps making barely a sound on the polished wooden floor. "People don't disappear like that without reason," Miss Marple replied gently, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "And neither do letters appear without a cause." Sylvia flinched, and Miss Marple saw it, the slight tightening of the woman's grip on the edge of the doorframe, the tension that passed through her like an electric current. "Is it a warning?" Sylvia asked, her voice trembling again, though this time with something deeper than fear. There was an edge of something darker to her words. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes softened with the understanding of an older woman who had seen too much to be fooled by the surface of things. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps approached. Sir Randolph returned, his face pale, his usual composure faltering for the first time Miss Marple could remember. "I don't know what to make of it," Sir Randolph said, his voice tight with frustration. "Fenwick's room is locked, and there's no sign of him anywhere. The grounds are clear, too. It's as if he simply vanished." Miss Marple watched as Sir Randolph's gaze briefly flickered toward Sylvia, as though unsure whether he should say more in front of her. Sylvia's posture stiffened, and she looked down at the floor again, biting her lip. Miss Marple was certain that there was more to this story than anyone was willing to admit. "Have you checked the stable?" Miss Marple asked quietly, her voice as calm as ever, though the sharpness of her words cut through the uneasy air. "Of course we've checked the stable," Sir Randolph replied, his tone sharp but laced with the strain of frustration. "I'll have a look again, though, just in case." With that, he turned to leave, but paused. "Do you think we're overreacting? It's probably just some foolish prank or—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice soft but unwavering. "I don't believe it's a prank, Sir Randolph. When someone vanishes from the safety of their own home, it's rarely trivial." He nodded curtly and left the room, the door swinging closed with an audible click behind him. As soon as he was gone, Miss Marple turned her full attention back to Sylvia, who now looked pale and tense, her hands twisting in front of her. "I didn't mean to upset anyone," Sylvia muttered, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. "But "Tell me, Sylvia," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but insistent. "What is it you know that you're not telling us?" Sylvia's gaze snapped up to meet Miss Marple's, her eyes wide with alarm. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple said nothing, only watching her with an unwavering gaze that was at once kind and piercing. She had learned, through years of practice, that people often betrayed themselves with the smallest movements, the way they held their breath, the shift of their eyes, the sudden tightening of their grip. And Sylvia Bradford, for all her charm and grace, was no exception. Sylvia hesitated, then sighed, lowering her shoulders in resignation. "I saw something I shouldn't have, but I didn't know what to make of it. It was just a glimpse." "A glimpse of what?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet, calm, drawing Sylvia in. "A shadow," Sylvia said, her voice barely audible. "In the hallway. Just before I went to Fenwick's room, I thought it was him, but it didn't look like him. It was fleeting, just a shadow, but it was there. I don't know how to explain it." Miss Marple let the silence hang between them, the weight of Sylvia's words sinking into the air. The feeling in the room was thick with unease, as if the manor itself was holding its breath. The old house seemed to groan softly, the wind rattling the windows like a warning. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit, but Miss Marple knew better than to rush to conclusions. A glimpse of a shadow was hardly enough to accuse anyone of anything. Yet she knew there was more hidden here than met the eye. "You've been very helpful, Sylvia," Miss Marple said softly, her voice laced with a reassuring calm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll take a walk around the grounds myself." Sylvia nodded, her face pale but grateful for Miss Marple's presence. The older woman had a way of making people feel as though they weren't being judged, even when they feared they might be. Miss Marple moved past her with a quiet grace, her eyes now focused on the garden beyond the windows. There was much left to uncover, and Miss Marple knew it would take time. But time, after all, was something she had plenty of. And she had learned long ago that the truth, no matter how elusive, always found its way to the surface. The manor grounds were quiet, the kind of stillness that made the air seem thick and heavy. Miss Marple walked slowly, her feet brushing against the neatly trimmed grass, her eyes scanning the distant corners of the estate. The garden party had dissolved into hushed conversations and tense movements. The guests, once full of life and laughter, now seemed like shadows of their former selves, moving about with an almost mechanical purpose. Everyone had a role to play in this unfolding drama, whether they realized it or not. She passed by the flower beds where the roses, in full bloom, stood as silent sentinels, their fragrance now tinged with something darker. The grandeur of Blackthorn Manor, with its ivy-clad walls and towering windows, had always held a certain charm. Yet now, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the mansion seemed to loom in an unsettling way, its dark windows reflecting only emptiness. The stillness of the estate seemed to mock the anxiety that clung to the air like a thick fog. Her footsteps were quiet, deliberate, each one carrying her further from the house and deeper into the grounds. Miss Marple had learned long ago that people, in their eagerness to find answers, often overlooked the simplest truths. They rushed, eager to solve the mystery, to untangle the web of confusion that had suddenly enshrouded them. But Miss Marple knew better. It was the small things that mattered, the ones no one else paid attention to. She had always been a patient observer, content to wait for the world to reveal its secrets at its own pace. She reached the far side of the garden where a row of tall, ancient trees stood like sentinels. Their gnarled branches twisted and stretched, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. Miss Marple paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the trees as though searching for something hidden. The quiet seemed almost unnatural here, the rustling of the leaves strangely absent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. A faint movement caught her eye near the edge of the garden. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the flutter of a figure slipping behind the stable. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, the small flicker of movement sparking a sense of intrigue. She had not seen the figure clearly, but something about the way they had moved, furtive, almost too deliberate, made her instinctively aware that this was no casual passer-by. With a gentle sigh, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and moved toward the stable, her steps light but purposeful. The evening air was growing cooler now, the sky slowly transitioning from gold to a deep, dusky blue. The stable loomed ahead, its doors slightly ajar, the faintest sounds of shifting hay and the scent of damp earth drifting from within. As she approached the stable, Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned the area. The figure she had glimpsed earlier was gone now, swallowed up by the shadows. She took a careful step closer, her gaze shifting from the open doors of the stable to the quiet patch of ground just beyond it. There was nothing amiss at first glance, but Miss Marple knew better than to rely on first impressions. Her fingers brushed the edge of the door as she peered inside, careful not to disturb anything. The interior of the stable was dim, the only light coming from the fading glow of the evening sky. The smell of hay and horses filled the air, mingling with the sharper scent of something metallic. Blood, perhaps, though Miss Marple couldn't say for certain. She took a slow step forward, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. There, in the far corner, just barely visible, was a pile of hay that had been disturbed. The small mound was out of place, the straw shifted in a way that suggested someone had been there recently, moving with haste. Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the hay, her heart quickening ever so slightly. Beneath the layers of straw, she could feel something cold and hard, a smooth surface that didn't belong. She gently shifted the hay aside, her breath caught in her chest. There, buried beneath the straw, was a small, ornate pocket watch, its gold casing gleaming faintly in the dim light. The watch was engraved with intricate patterns, the kind of detail that could easily be overlooked by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Miss Marple's lips parted in quiet surprise, her mind racing to make the connections. The watch had been carefully placed here, not dropped or abandoned carelessly. It was an odd thing to find in a stable, especially one as secluded as this. She ran her fingers over the casing, the cold metal sending a shiver through her fingers. She slipped the watch into her pocket and stood for a moment, allowing the silence of the stable to envelop her. Her thoughts swirled, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place slowly but surely. Mr. Fenwick's disappearance, the shadow she had seen near the manor, and now this watch. Each thread was weaving a more complicated tapestry than she had first anticipated. This was no simple disappearance, no ordinary incident. It was something far more intricate, something far more deliberate. Miss Marple turned to leave the stable, her thoughts heavy with the weight of what she had discovered. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and every detail, every whisper of suspicion, pointed towards something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. But the village was not ready for that yet. The search would continue, the questions would grow louder, but the answers would come only to those patient enough to wait for them. As Miss Marple stepped back into the fading light of the garden, she paused for a moment to take in the surroundings. The manor loomed behind her, its windows dark and unyielding. The garden, once a place of serenity, now felt colder, more foreboding. The party, so full of life just hours ago, had now dissolved into whispered conversations and wary glances. The village of St. Mary Mead had never seemed smaller, more insular than it did in that moment. She knew what needed to be done, but she also knew that the road ahead would be long, winding, and fraught with more questions than answers. There was something more to Mr. Fenwick's disappearance, something that ran far deeper than anyone in the village could yet fathom. But Miss Marple had always prided herself on her patience. She would let the clues reveal themselves in their own time, and when they did, she would be ready. The following morning dawned clear and bright, but the mood at Blackthorn Manor was anything but serene. The remnants of last night's garden party had been swept away, yet the air seemed thick with an unsettling silence, as though the manor itself had sensed the shift in the world outside its walls. Miss Marple, ever composed, sat by the fire in the drawing room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she listened to the soft murmur of voices drifting through the house. She was no stranger to tension, and she knew that the disappearance of Mr. Fenwick had caused ripples far beyond the immediate circle of guests. Sir Randolph had been on edge since the moment he returned from his search of the grounds, his frustration mounting as each hour passed with no new information. The police had been called, but Miss Marple could tell they were already growing weary of the case. Their questions had been too straightforward, their conclusions too quick. They were ready to move on to the next thing, not realizing that they were overlooking the very things that mattered most. Miss Marple's thoughts turned once more to the pocket watch she had found the night before. It had been carefully concealed beneath the hay in the stable, almost as if it were meant to be found, but not too soon. The watch, an intricately designed piece of craftsmanship, seemed to hold more than just the usual markers of time. It was more than a simple heirloom. There was a weight to it, a sense of purpose that Miss Marple could not ignore. She had seen that kind of careful placement before, in situations that didn't seem to make sense until the very last piece of the puzzle slid into place. She paused in her knitting, her fingers stilling as her gaze drifted over the fire. There were too many things that didn't add up, and her mind kept returning to one unsettling thought. Sylvia Bradford. There was something about her that felt off, something that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. The woman had been too shaken last night, too quick to hide behind the letter in her hands. Miss Marple had caught the fleeting look in Sylvia's eyes when she spoke of the shadow in the hall, and though she had said little, it had been enough to stir suspicion in the old detective. There was more there, more to be uncovered, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. The door to the drawing room opened slowly, and Sir Randolph entered, his face drawn tight with the stress of the situation. He was dressed in his customary dark suit, though the jacket hung loosely on his frame, as if it no longer quite fit the man who had worn it for so many years. "I've spoken with the police again," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "They're certain Fenwick has simply gone off somewhere, perhaps to visit family or take a walk. They're ready to close the case, Miss Marple. I don't think they'll be giving it much more attention." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "They're eager to settle things quickly, I see." "Yes," Sir Randolph replied, his tone edged with frustration. "But I can't shake the feeling that something is terribly wrong. I don't want to believe that he would simply vanish like this. He's been with the family for years." "I understand," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "But sometimes, Mr. Hastings, we must be willing to look at things from a different perspective." He looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I believe Mr. Fenwick's disappearance is not a simple matter of a man leaving on his own accord. It's too neat, too purposeful. And there's something else. Something in the way people are reacting. The tension is palpable, even if they don't see it themselves." Sir Randolph's gaze flickered toward the window, as though searching for the words that might explain what he was feeling. "And Sylvia?" he asked, after a long pause. Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. "I believe she knows more than she's letting on. She's been rather guarded since the night of the party, and her reactions have been revealing, to say the least." Sir Randolph shifted uneasily, his fingers drumming nervously against the arm of his chair. "She's only been staying with us for a few months. I don't know her well, but I can't imagine her being involved in something like this." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was clear. "People are rarely as simple as they appear, Mr. Hastings. We all carry hidden burdens, even if we try to keep them buried." There was a long silence between them, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Sir Randolph stared into the flames, lost in thought. Miss Marple's fingers moved again, the steady rhythm of her knitting a quiet counterpoint to the growing tension. "Do you think she's involved in Fenwick's disappearance?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think she knows something," Miss Marple said carefully. "And I suspect that something is tied to the pocket watch." "The pocket watch?" Sir Randolph repeated, raising an eyebrow in confusion. "What does a watch have to do with this?" "It's a clue, Mr. Hastings. A deliberate one, placed carefully where only certain eyes would find it. Fenwick didn't leave that watch behind by accident. It's as much a message as it is an object." Sir Randolph shook his head, clearly not following her logic. "But why? Why would anyone go to such lengths for something so trivial?" Miss Marple paused, allowing her words to sink in. "There is nothing trivial about this watch, Mr. Hastings. Whoever left it there knew that it would eventually be found, but not until it was needed. It is a signal, a small but significant piece of a much larger puzzle." Sir Randolph stood up abruptly, his agitation rising once more. "So, what are you suggesting? That Sylvia somehow had a hand in Fenwick's disappearance?" Miss Marple allowed herself a small, patient smile. "I'm suggesting that we have not looked closely enough, Mr. Hastings. Sometimes, the smallest details. An object out of place, a glance that lasts too long, a seemingly insignificant event, are the ones that hold the key to everything." "Sir." Randolph opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he stood silently by the window, staring out at the grounds of Blackthorn Manor, his mind working furiously. Miss Marple watched him for a moment before turning her gaze back to the fire, the crackling warmth offering a stark contrast to the cold, mounting tension in the room. The mystery was unfolding, layer by layer, but Miss Marple knew that it was far from over. There were more questions, more secrets to uncover, and she had a feeling that the answers lay far deeper than anyone in the house could yet imagine. The game was afoot, and Miss Marple would wait patiently for the moment when the truth revealed itself. The days that followed Mr. Fenwick's disappearance seemed to blur together in a haze of quiet anxiety. Sir Randolph's efforts to involve the police had only led to polite dismissals and assurances that it was likely a temporary affair, perhaps a misunderstanding, a man retreating into solitude for a while. The manor itself, once bustling with the energy of last week's party, had settled into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of servants moving through the halls or the faint murmurs of the guests, now reduced to a handful in scattered conversations. Miss Marple had spent the last few days observing, listening, and waiting. She could sense the growing discomfort among the remaining inhabitants of Blackthorn Manor, and she had noted with quiet interest that no one seemed to be particularly concerned with the fact that Mr. Fenwick had simply vanished. It was a strange indifference, one that Miss Marple had seen time and again, though it rarely emerged in such a controlled environment. What did it mean when a man could disappear without a single person in the house showing any genuine panic? One morning, after another fruitless search of the grounds and an endless round of interviews with the manor's staff, Miss Marple found herself walking through the long, dimly lit corridors of Blackthorn Manor. The floors creaked beneath her steps, and the wallpaper, faded from years of neglect, peeled away in delicate strips, revealing the age-old wood behind. The house was grand, of course, imposing even, but there was something about its size that made the halls feel smaller, more confining, as though the walls themselves were closing in around the occupants. She paused before a door at the end of the hall, listening to the muffled conversation within. It was Sylvia Bradford's voice, though it was softer than usual, more measured. Miss Marple's hand hovered near the doorknob for a moment before she pushed the door open slightly, just enough to hear the conversation clearly. The room inside was dark, the heavy curtains drawn against the morning light. Sylvia was standing near the window, her back to Miss Marple, her fingers drumming nervously against the sill. "I don't think we should go any further." Sylvia's voice trembled, slightly. "If we're not careful, it will all unravel, and then—" Miss Marple's heart quickened as she heard the faint rustle of fabric, followed by the sound of another person moving in the room. She stepped into the doorway fully, and there, standing in front of the window, was Dr. Horace Minton. His face was drawn tight, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an edge of discomfort. He didn't seem to notice Miss Marple at first, too caught up in whatever private conversation had been unfolding. "I don't see why you're so frightened," Dr. Minton said, his tone unusually firm. "You've said it yourself, Sylvia. We can't turn back now. It's done." Sylvia spun around, her eyes wide with panic. "I don't want to be involved in this anymore. We've already taken too much. What if someone finds out?" Dr. Minton stepped forward, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "No one will find out. We've covered our tracks. And besides, we're too far along to back out now." The room fell silent for a moment, save for the soft rustle of Sylvia's dress. Miss Marple could see the two of them standing there, caught in a web of their own making. Sylvia's distress was palpable, while Dr. Minton's calmness seemed to contrast sharply, as though he had some hold over her, some power that made her comply with whatever plan they had set in motion. Miss Marple's thoughts raced. What was it that had brought them to this moment? What had they done, and why? Sylvia's voice broke the silence. "But Fenwick—" "He's gone," Dr. Minton interrupted, his voice firm but tinged with something darker. "We did what we had to do. There's no going back now." Miss Marple's heart pounded as the pieces began to fit into place. The tension between the two of them, the fear in Sylvia's eyes, and Dr. Minton's unnerving calmness, it all spoke to something more than just a simple disappearance. This was not just about Mr. Fenwick vanishing into thin air. No, there was something far more sinister at play, something that had been set into motion long before the evening of the party. Before she could step forward and confront them, a creak from the floorboard caused Sylvia to glance up. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and for the briefest moment there was a flicker of something, guilt, fear, perhaps even recognition, before Sylvia quickly turned away, her face flushing with color. "Miss Marple," Dr. Minton said, his voice smooth and controlled. "What brings you here?" "I was simply passing by," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but sharp, like the click of a well-worn needle. "I do hope I'm not interrupting." Sylvia's shoulders slumped, and she pressed her hand to her forehead, clearly struggling to maintain composure. Miss Marple watched her closely, her eyes not missing the subtle tremor in the woman's fingers. There was something about Sylvia's behavior that didn't sit right with her, something in the way she moved, the way she reacted, that betrayed the depths of the situation. "We were just discussing the recent developments," Dr. Minton continued, his expression neutral, though there was an edge to his words that suggested he knew far more than he was willing to share. "It's been a difficult time for all of us." "It certainly has," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes never leaving Sylvia. "But I do wonder, Dr. Minton, if you might be underestimating the complexity of the situation. Sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how hard one tries to bury it." The words seemed to hang in the air, and Sylvia visibly stiffened, her face pale. Dr. Minton gave a tight-lipped smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure we'll sort things out soon enough." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her voice tinged with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the story was far from finished. She took a slow step back, her eyes never leaving the two of them, before she turned and walked out of the room, her mind whirling with the revelations that had just fallen into place. As she left the hall behind, the weight of the situation settled on her like a heavy cloak. There was more to this mystery than anyone had imagined, and Miss Marple knew that, in time, every thread would unravel, if only she was patient enough to let it. The days had grown colder, and the once joyous atmosphere of Blackthorn Manor had become thick with tension. Miss Marple could feel the unease in every corner, every whispered conversation that seemed to stop abruptly when she entered the room. The villagers, once eager to discuss the latest gossip and small matters of daily life, had now withdrawn into themselves as if they were afraid to speak too freely. Sir Randolph seemed perpetually on edge, his mind clearly preoccupied with the mystery of Mr. Fenwick's disappearance. Major Blackwell, usually the first to speak his mind, now spent his days pacing restlessly around the estate, unable to shake the growing suspicion that the truth was slipping further from their grasp. Miss Marple, however, had a sense that the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. She had spent hours combing through the manor's corridors, listening, watching, and waiting for something, anything that would reveal the truth behind Fenwick's vanishing. But it was not only the butler's disappearance that intrigued her. It was the strange, unsettling behavior of those around her, the subtle shifts in the way people spoke, the way they moved, and the things they chose not to say. The carefully constructed facades were beginning to crack, and Miss Marple knew that the key to unlocking the mystery lay somewhere hidden beneath the surface of their carefully crafted lives. Her thoughts were interrupted one afternoon as she sat in the drawing room, sipping her tea. A soft knock at the door caught her attention, and she looked up to see Sylvia Bradford standing in the doorway. The woman's expression was strained, her eyes red-rimmed as though she had not slept in days. She was wearing the same somber black dress she had worn since Fenwick's disappearance, and the sight of her was enough to make Miss Marple's heart quicken. There was something different about Sylvia now, something more than just the fear she had exhibited the night of the garden party. It was as though she had been pulled into something much deeper, something that had begun to unravel her very sense of self. "Miss Marple," Sylvia said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to speak with you." Miss Marple set down her cup, her gaze steady as she studied the woman before her. "Of course, Sylvia. Please come in." Sylvia stepped into the room slowly, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She avoided Miss Marple's eyes at first, instead glancing nervously at the empty chairs around the room, as though she were looking for a place to sit but could not bring herself to settle. There was an air of desperation about her, a sense that whatever she had come to say had been weighing heavily on her for some time. "I don't know who else to talk to," Sylvia continued, her voice faltering. "There's so much I've kept inside, so much that—" She paused, taking a shaky breath. "It's all coming apart, Miss Marple. I don't know how to fix it." Miss Marple remained silent, watching her intently. She could sense that the woman was on the verge of breaking, and she knew that the moment she had waited for had finally arrived. The truth, which had been hidden so carefully beneath layers of guilt and fear, was about to surface. Miss Marple gave a small, reassuring nod, gesturing for Sylvia to continue. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Sylvia said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't mean for Mr. Fenwick to—" She stopped herself, her face contorting with the effort to hold back tears. It wasn't supposed to go this far. It was just a little lie, a small thing. But it kept growing, and now I don't know how to make it stop. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze never wavering from Sylvia's face. "What lie, Sylvia?" she asked gently. "What is it that you're hiding?" Sylvia's lips trembled, and for a long moment she seemed unable to speak. She clenched her hands tightly, her knuckles white, and took a deep breath as though bracing herself. Finally, she whispered, "I never wanted to hurt anyone, but I was involved in Mr. Fenwick's disappearance." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with an unbearable weight. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, her voice soft as she responded. "What do you mean, involved?" Sylvia hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if searching for some means of escape. But there was no running now. The truth had already begun to spill, and there was no turning back. "I didn't know what to do. I thought it would be easier if he was just out of the picture." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her heart quickening with the realization that she was getting closer to the heart of the mystery. "You're saying that you were part of what happened to Mr. Fenwick?" Sylvia nodded, her face pale with shame. "It wasn't supposed to be this way. He found out things that could ruin everything. And when he threatened to tell Sir Randolph, I just couldn't let him." Sylvia's voice broke as the weight of her confession seemed to crash down on her. "I didn't mean for him to disappear. I only wanted to scare him, to make him leave. But then he really did vanish. And I don't know where he is. I don't know what happened." Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed Sylvia's words. This was not just a case of a butler disappearing. It was a case of buried secrets and threats that had spiraled out of control. Sylvia had been part of something much darker, something far more dangerous than she had initially let on. And now, the woman was left alone, caught in the web of her own lies and actions. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, her thoughts turning inward. She could see now the full scope of what had been taking place behind the walls of Blackthorn Manor, the secrets, the betrayals, and the carefully hidden truths that had been festering beneath the surface. Sylvia, in her panic, had made a choice, but Miss Marple knew that the real story was far from over. "You've made the right choice in telling me, Sylvia," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but filled with compassion. "Now it's time to bring the truth to light." Sylvia looked at her, her face a mix of fear and relief. Do you think it's too late to make it right?" Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on Sylvia's trembling arm. "It's never too late for the truth, my dear, but it will take time and courage." The next morning was foggy, the mist rolling in from the nearby woods like a blanket, obscuring the distant edges of Blackthorn Manor. The early light struggled to penetrate the thick cloud, casting everything in a soft, diffused glow that made the house feel like it was suspended between reality and some dreamlike state. The silence in the halls was unnerving, and Miss Marple moved through them with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had long since grown accustomed to the quiet mysteries that clung to the air of such grand estates. In the drawing room, Sir Randolph sat near the fireplace, his gaze distant as he stared into the dancing flames. His posture was slumped, the weight of days filled with unanswered questions and growing suspicions bearing down on him. Miss Marple knew that the burden of not knowing, of feeling helpless in the face of something as bewildering as Mr. Fenwick's disappearance, was wearing on him. She had seen it before, the way people lost themselves in uncertainty, unsure of who to trust or where to turn, but she had never been one to simply wait for answers to appear on their own. She had learned long ago that in matters such as these, patience was not a passive endeavor. It was a skill. Miss Marple approached the fire, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor, and placed a small cup of tea on the table beside Sir Randolph. He didn't react at first, his eyes still locked on the flames. She waited quietly for a moment before speaking. "You've been very still this morning, Sir Randolph," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but purposeful. "But the world doesn't stand still no matter how much we wish it would." He blinked, as though pulled from some deep thought, and finally turned his head toward her. There was a moment of recognition in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced with the familiar, resigned fatigue. "I'm not sure what to do anymore, Miss Marple. The police have all but written this off. They think he's run off, that he'll turn up soon enough, and everyone can go back to their lives. But I know better." "You're right," Miss Marple agreed quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "This is no simple case of a man going missing. Too much is hidden beneath the surface." Sir Randolph sighed heavily, his gaze falling back to the fire. "What do we do now, then? I've tried everything I can think of, and every step I take only seems to make the situation worse." "There's always a way forward," Miss Marple said softly. "But sometimes it requires us to see things differently, to look not just at the obvious, but at the things people overlook." She let the words settle in the air between them before continuing. "You must speak to Sylvia again." He looked at her, a mixture of surprise and confusion crossing his features. "Sylvia? You think she knows something more?" "I do," Miss Marple said, her eyes steady as she met his gaze. "And I believe that whatever she knows is important. She's been hiding something connected to Mr. Fenwick's disappearance. I've seen it in the way she behaves, in the way she reacts to even the smallest mention of his name." Sir Randolph's brow furrowed. "But what could she possibly know? She's hardly been here long enough to—" "She knows enough," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Perhaps not directly, but indirectly. She's involved whether she admits it or not. And her involvement is tied to things that go beyond simple misunderstandings or accidents." Sir Randolph leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as though trying to stave off the headache that always seemed to follow moments like this. "I don't know how to approach her. She's been so distant. And now, with everything that's happened, it feels like any trust we had between us is falling apart." "That's the nature of secrets," Miss Marple said. "They build walls between people, walls that become harder to tear down the longer they stand. But the truth has a way of breaking through eventually." He stared at her for a long moment, as though trying to understand the words she had just spoken. Finally, he nodded, though his movements were slow, resigned. "I'll speak to her. I just hope you're right." "I believe I am," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "But sometimes, people need a nudge, a little push in the right direction." Sir Randolph stood up, his movement stiff with exhaustion. "I'll go to her, but Miss Marple, if she has nothing to tell me, if this is all just some wild goose chase, what then?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but there was an unspoken understanding in them that suggested she had already considered every possible outcome. "Then we'll know we've exhausted every possibility, but something tells me that won't be the case." He left the room without another word, and Miss Marple watched him go, her mind already turning over the small details she had observed over the past few days. She had been right about Sylvia, of that she was certain. The woman's nerves, the way she hesitated whenever Fenwick's name was brought up, the way she avoided eye contact with those who asked too many questions. It all pointed to guilt. But guilt for what? And more importantly, what role had Dr. Minton played in all of this? Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the night she had overheard Sylvia and Dr. Minton's conversation in the manor. There was more to it than just fear of being caught. There was something deeper at play, something they both seemed desperate to hide, as though the weight of it might destroy them if it came to light. Minutes stretched into hours as Miss Marple sat alone in the drawing room, her mind quietly working through the possibilities. She had spent enough time observing human behavior to know that every action, every word spoken, left behind a trace. It was a matter of finding those traces and putting them together in a way that told a story. And she was certain now that the story was not over. Far from it. The truth was still out there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When Sir Randolph returned, his face was pale, but there was a new determination in his eyes. He didn't speak immediately, but Miss Marple knew that something had shifted. He had learned what he needed to, and whatever the outcome, she knew they were one step closer to uncovering the truth. The afternoon passed in a quiet blur, the fog outside thickening until it seemed to swallow the manor whole. Inside, the atmosphere was no better. Tense, still as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something they couldn't yet name. Sir Randolph had returned to the drawing room after his conversation with Sylvia, but Miss Marple could see that the exchange had drained him. Was quieter now, his movements slower, his thoughts clearly occupied with something heavier than before. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the subtleties of human emotion, noticed the change immediately. He had learned something. The question now was what? She studied him carefully, watching the way he seemed to flinch whenever the silence stretched too long between them. He had been a man of action, or at least he had tried to be. But now he seemed as if he were caught between two worlds. The world of reality, where Mr. Fenwick had simply disappeared, and the world of suspicion, where the lines between truth and deceit were becoming impossibly blurred. "Well?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived a long life and knew exactly when the moment was right to press. "What did she say?" Sir Randolph sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair as he sank into the chair opposite her. His face was pale, the color having drained from his features during the brief but intense conversation. She denied it at first, said she didn't know anything more about Fenwick's disappearance than anyone else, that she hadn't seen or heard anything unusual in the days before he went missing. But Miss Marple... He paused, and there was a hesitation in his voice that made her instinctively lean forward, urging him to continue. "I saw it in her eyes. The guilt. She couldn't keep it hidden, no matter how hard she tried." Miss Marple nodded, her expression soft but resolute. And then... Sir Randolph's voice dropped to a whisper, as though he were afraid the words themselves might shatter the fragile air between them. "She told me something that made my blood run cold. She said that Fenwick had known. He had found something out, something that could ruin everything for both of us." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained composed. She had suspected as much, but hearing it, confirmed, was another matter entirely. "What could he have discovered?" "I don't know," Sir Randolph confessed, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "She wouldn't say. She told me that he had started acting strangely, that he had begun to ask too many questions. She said he'd been... His voice faltered. He'd been snooping around, looking into things that should have stayed buried. And when she tried to stop him, tried to warn him off, he just laughed it off. She said he didn't take her seriously, that he'd already made up his mind about something, and nothing she said could change it. A long silence hung between them, the weight of the words settling into the room like the fog outside. Miss Marple's mind raced, processing the details, piecing them together in a way that made everything start to make sense. She could see it now, the underlying tension, the unspoken fears that had driven Sylvia to the brink of confession. Sylvia had not acted alone. There was someone else, someone whose influence had stretched into every corner of Blackthorn Manor, manipulating the situation from the shadows. "It sounds as though he knew too much," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice carrying the careful weight of truth. "And he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered whatever it was you and Sylvia were trying to hide." Sir Randolph's gaze shifted downward, his eyes clouded with shame. "I never wanted any of this to happen," he murmured. "But when Fenwick started asking those questions, when he wouldn't stop digging..." He stopped, his words hanging in the air, unfinished. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger. She could feel the shame in his words, the regret that clung to his every syllable. But there was something else too, something deeper than the guilt he had been carrying. "You didn't want it, but you let it happen," she said softly. "Didn't you?" Sir Randolph flinched as though struck, his eyes snapping up to meet hers. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat tightened, and for a long moment, he said nothing. "I didn't know what else to do," he finally whispered. "Fenwick was a loyal servant, but loyalty only goes so far. I couldn't let him ruin everything, not after all that had been built." Not after what?" Miss Marple prompted, her voice gentle but insistent. Sir Randolph looked away, his jaw tightening. "After the arrangements had been made," he muttered, his words barely audible. "The plans were set. I thought that if we just waited a little longer, everything would fall into place. But then Fenwick started snooping around, and I couldn't risk it." "Risk what, Sir Randolph?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice steady and unyielding. "What was it that Fenwick found out that made you and Sylvia so desperate?" Sir Randolph closed his eyes, as though trying to block out the reality of the situation. "I made promises," he said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "Promises I couldn't keep. I was involved in something illegal, something that could ruin my family's name forever. And Fenwick, he found out. He wasn't just snooping, he was getting too close." Miss Marple's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression calm, her voice steady. "And that's when Sylvia stepped in." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "She tried to stop him, to convince him to leave it alone, but Fenwick wasn't going to stop. He was going to expose everything, so we made a plan to make him disappear, and now..." He trailed off, his words faltering. "Now I don't know where he is, or if he's even alive." Miss Marple's mind was spinning with the revelation, each new detail adding a layer of complexity to the mystery. She had known that the truth was far darker than it appeared, but hearing it all laid bare was another matter entirely. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but there was still so much left to uncover. Sylvia had been part of it, yes, but so too had Sir Randolph, his desperation, his fear, his willingness to do anything to protect his secrets. "You've made a grave mistake, Sir Randolph," Miss Marple said quietly. "But there is still time to make things right." He looked at her, his face etched with regret. "What do you mean?" "You need to tell the police everything," Miss Marple said firmly. "You need to come clean, to face the consequences of your actions. It may not undo what has been done, but it will bring an end to the lies." The truth is the only way forward. Sir Randolph remained silent for a long time, his gaze distant and unfocused. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can." "You must," Miss Marple replied simply, her voice unwavering. "Because until you do, none of us will be free." And with that, the weight of the secret that had haunted Blackthorn Manor for so long began to shift, just slightly, towards its inevitable revelation. The morning that followed Sir Randolph's confession was clouded with a heavy stillness that seemed to weigh down everything in the house. The fog had not lifted, and it clung to the windows like a thick blanket, casting the manor in a cold, muted light. The distant sound of church bells echoed faintly through the grounds, marking the start of another day, though for those within Blackthorn Manor, it felt as though time itself had slowed. Each second seemed to stretch on endlessly, dragging them all through a morass of guilt and fear, until the truth, so long hidden, could no longer be ignored. Miss Marple sat at the small desk in the corner of the drawing room, the half-filled teacup beside her, untouched. Her hands rested idly in her lap, her eyes focused on the window, though her thoughts were far from the scenery outside. Sir Randolph had confessed, finally, to the role he had played in the disappearance of Mr. Fenwick. The weight of it had been clear in his face, in his words, and it was a weight that Miss Marple knew would not easily be lifted. She had seen guilt before, but rarely did it come so clearly and deeply from someone who had been both victim and perpetrator. Her mind churned with the details of their conversation. Sir Randolph's involvement in something illegal, something so deeply entwined with his family's legacy that he would rather see someone disappear than risk it being exposed, had been the catalyst. But it was not just his fear of exposure that had pushed him to make such a terrible decision. There had been something else, something darker that Miss Marple could not yet fully understand. The feeling that there was still more to discover lingered in her mind, pulling her in different directions as she pieced together the fragments of the story she had gathered. The house was quiet now, the servants moving about their duties with a solemn air, their faces reflecting the unease that had settled over them. Major Blackwell was nowhere to be found, and Dr. Minton too seemed to have withdrawn into his own world, leaving Miss Marple to wonder how much each of them knew, or if any of them had been as clueless as they appeared. There was something in the way they had all moved through the days since Fenwick's disappearance that told her they had been keeping secrets of their own. Small ones, perhaps, but secrets nonetheless. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her old bones creaking as she made her way to the door. She needed to speak with Sylvia once more. The woman had been silent since the night of her confession, retreating into the shadows of the manor as though she hoped the walls would hide her. But Miss Marple knew that silence was no protection. It only served to make the truth more elusive, more difficult to confront. And Sylvia, like everyone else in this house, would eventually have to face the consequences of her actions. As she moved down the corridor, Miss Marple could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere up ahead. She paused, listening carefully. The footsteps were uneven, hesitant, as though the person walking was lost in thought or unsure of their destination. A moment later, Sylvia appeared at the end of the hall, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Miss Marple," Sylvia said, her voice low and tentative. She stopped a few feet away, as though unsure whether to approach or retreat. The sight of her, so fragile and broken, stirred something in Miss Marple's heart. This was not the same woman who had once moved through the manor with grace and charm. This was a woman who had been shattered by the weight of her own choices, a woman who had been forced to confront the consequences of her actions. "Good morning, Sylvia," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "I was hoping we might have a moment to talk." Sylvia nodded, her eyes downcast. She didn't speak at first, but Miss Marple could see the turmoil in her expression, the conflict that flickered just beneath the surface. Finally, after a long silence, Sylvia looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't want to be involved in any of it, but I couldn't stop myself. I thought that if I just kept quiet, if I just did what was asked of me, everything would go back to normal." Miss Marple stepped forward slightly, her presence calm but insistent. "Sylvia, you've been living with this for a long time now, and the longer you hold on to it, the harder it will be to move forward. The truth has a way of making itself known, no matter how much we try to hide it." Sylvia's shoulders trembled slightly, as though the weight of Miss Marple's words was too much to bear. "I was afraid," she said softly, almost to herself. Afraid of what would happen if Fenwick told Sir Randolph what he knew. Afraid of losing everything, and then, when he wouldn't stop asking, when he wouldn't let it go. She trailed off, her words choking in her throat. "I thought I could handle it, that I could fix it, but now I don't know what to do." Miss Marple's voice was low, full of quiet understanding. "You've already taken the first step, Sylvia. You've admitted the truth, and that is more than most people ever do. But you must take another step. The truth cannot remain hidden forever. You must face what you've done and be prepared to make amends, no matter how difficult it may be." For a long time, Sylvia didn't speak. She stood there, her body tense, her hands shaking slightly as she processed Miss Marple's words. Finally, she looked up, meeting Miss Marple's gaze with a clarity that had been absent before. "What should I do?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with the rawness of someone who had been carrying a burden far too long. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it right." Miss Marple smiled softly, a faint warmth in her eyes. "Sometimes the only way forward is to face the truth head-on, no matter how painful it might be. You've already started that journey, Sylvia. Now it's time to take the next step. Whatever happens next, you will no longer be hiding. You'll be free." Sylvia took a deep breath, her eyes closing for a moment as she absorbed the weight of the words. When she opened her eyes again, they were filled with a new resolve. "I'll do what needs to be done," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll face whatever comes." Miss Marple nodded, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult, but it was a path that had to be walked. The truth had been revealed, and now, with each step, it would lead them all toward a resolution, and perhaps in the end, that was the only thing that could bring them peace. The days following Sylvia's decision to confront the truth were marked by a quiet intensity, as if the entire manor had exhaled a breath it had been holding for far too long. Sir Randolph, having finally accepted the inevitable, had agreed to take the matter to the authorities. The police, who had been ready to close the case, were now faced with a situation far more complicated than they had expected. They had assumed that Mr. Fenwick had simply left under his own volition, perhaps seeking a new life or hiding from some unknown fear. But now, as the threads began to unravel, it became clear that there was far more to the story. Miss Marple, who had been silently watching the developments, knew that the key to solving the mystery lay not just in the physical evidence, but in understanding the complex web of emotions and secrets that had bound the characters together. She had always believed that human behavior was the most telling clue, and it was through the smallest actions and the most subtle reactions that the truth would emerge. The day of the final confrontation arrived with a biting chill in the air. The fog had cleared, leaving behind a crisp, sharp morning. Blackthorn Manor stood resolutely against the backdrop of a pale sky, its imposing presence both a symbol of the wealth and secrets it contained. The manor's rooms were quiet, the servants going about their work with an air of solemnity that matched the mood of the house. Miss Marple stood in the drawing room, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she observed the scene before her. Sir Randolph, his face a mixture of apprehension and guilt, had agreed to meet with the police one final time. Sylvia was sitting near the window, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her expression one of quiet resolve. Major Blackwell, who had been the most vocal in his skepticism, stood near the door. his arms crossed as though guarding the space between them and the truth. Dr. Minton had been absent for the day, his whereabouts unclear, though Miss Marple had her suspicions. She had learned much about the man in the past days, how his calm demeanor had often masked a deeper, more controlling nature. He was, after all, a man who thrived on secrets, and Miss Marple had no doubt that he had known more than he had ever let on. The police arrived, their presence both official and unsettling. The officer in charge, a young man with sharp eyes, stepped into the room with a professional air. "We're ready to proceed, Sir Randolph," he said, nodding to the man who had, in his own way, brought them here. Sir Randolph nodded stiffly, his gaze darting towards Sylvia, who met his eyes briefly before looking away. Miss Marple could see the internal struggle written across their faces, the realization that no matter what happened next, there would be no returning to the lives they had once known. "It's time," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. The officer gestured for them to gather, and as the group huddled together, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to sweep over them one last time. There was a moment's silence, heavy with anticipation, before she finally spoke. Fenwick's disappearance, while mysterious at first, was never the result of a simple act of vanishing, Miss Marple said. It was, in fact, an act of necessity, a choice made by those who feared what the truth might bring. Sir Randolph looked at her, his expression unreadable, but Miss Marple could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew where she was going with this. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "Fenwick had stumbled upon something much larger than anyone realized. He had discovered that Blackthorn Manor's financial success, its very reputation, was built on a series of illegal dealings, hidden beneath the glossy veneer of aristocracy. Sylvia knew this, as did you, Sir Randolph. The secrets you both carried weighed heavily on your actions." A tense silence followed her words, the room seemingly holding its breath. "But Fenwick was a man of principles," Miss Marple said. "He didn't care for the wealth or the power. It wasn't about the money. He cared about the truth. And when he began to ask questions that none of you wanted answered, that's when you began to fear him. You saw him as a threat, and when someone is seen as a threat, well, things tend to get complicated." Sylvia flinched slightly at the words, her face paling as the weight of her involvement settled around her like a shroud. "And so, the plan was made," Miss Marple went on, her gaze now turning to Sir Randolph. "You, Sir Randolph, convinced Sylvia that Fenwick had to be stopped. You both agreed that his silence would come at too great a cost, and so, with the help of Dr. Minton, you orchestrated the disappearance. Not a simple disappearance, but a planned one. A disappearance that would ensure that Mr. Fenwick's knowledge would never see the light of day." Sir Randolph's face went pale, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. "Of course, you needed to ensure that Fenwick was never found," Miss Marple continued. "You staged his absence carefully, taking care to make it seem as though he had simply vanished without a trace, leaving no clues behind. But there was one thing you failed to account for, Sir Randolph." He looked at her, his expression shifting from guilt to confusion. "The one thing you forgot," Miss Marple said with a knowing smile, "was that someone like Mr. Fenwick would never leave behind something as important as his pocket watch. You underestimated the one thing he had always prided himself on, his sense of duty. He never would have abandoned something so valuable to him." There was a pause, as though the truth had finally dawned on everyone in the room. The silence was broken only by the soft rustle of fabric as the police officer took a step forward. "Where is Dr. Minton now?" Miss Marple asked, her voice suddenly sharper. The officer hesitated, his brow furrowing. "We haven't been able to locate him, ma'am. He's disappeared." A small, knowing smile crossed Miss Marple's lips. "I believe I know where he is," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "But the truth has already been exposed, and it will not be long before it reaches him." Sir Randolph's face crumpled as the enormity of the situation overtook him. He had been complicit, yes, but the reality of the lie he had lived was more than he could bear. The police moved forward, and the tension in the room loosened, the damning weight of their confession finally breaking through. Miss Marple stood there, her gaze calm, her heart steady, as the room began to shift. The story had come full circle. The truth had been uncovered, and with it, the pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. There was no more need for secrecy. There was only the inevitable reckoning of what had been hidden for so long. And as the police led Sir Randolph and Sylvia away, Miss Marple took one last look around Blackthorn Manor. It was still magnificent, still imposing, but now it seemed like a house that had borne witness to too many secrets. Secrets that, at last, had been laid to rest.